The summer of 1971 in Pine Hollow, Alabama, was the kind that settled into your bones like the breath of something ancient, the kind of heat that made the air hum and shimmer even after sunset. But for Elijah and Isaiah Cole, twin brothers born only 7 minutes apart, yet seemingly forged from the same unbreakable spirit. The heat was just background music to a life spent outdoors, scaling trees, mapping back trails, and learning to read the forest like scripture. At 24, they were already legends in their quiet town, not just because they were identical or because they were black men who refused to be boxed in by the world's limitations, but because they were fearless, thoughtful, and endlessly curious about the world beyond Pine Hollow's dusty roads. That July, the brothers planned one last expedition before their lives took different directions. Isaiah had just been offered a job as a photojournalist at a progressive magazine in Chicago, a dream he'd chased for years. Elijah, more grounded, more inward, had committed to staying back and helping their mother, Ruth, run the small repair shop their father had started before he died. But they needed this. One final journey together. One last summit to the top of Chimney Peak, a lesser-known ridge deep in the Appalachians that they'd read about in old cartographers' logs. They believed, with all the conviction of dreamers, that there was a vantage point hidden beyond the official trails where the sunrise would catch the valley like fire in glass. And Isaiah wanted to photograph it, to capture that instant before everything changed. On the morning of July 26th, Ruth stood at the porch of their small wooden house, arms crossed, eyes shadowed with unease. "You sure you boys don't want to wait for storm season to pass?" she asked gently, knowing her words were pebbles against the weight of their resolve. Elijah smiled and adjusted the yellow handkerchief tucked into his back pocket, his father's, now his. "Mama, it's 3 days. We'll be back before your Sunday pot roast." Isaiah slung his camera bag over his shoulder, patting the pouch as if to check that his Kodak was still safe inside. "And I'm bringing back the best shot this town has ever seen." Their mother sighed and handed them a battered shortwave radio, the same one their father had used in the 50s when mapping utility routes. "Take this," she whispered. "Check in every night and promise me you'll stay together." "We always do," they said in unison, with that twin grin that had melted her heart for 24 years. The two packed light, canvas backpacks with freeze-dried rations, hand-drawn maps they had pieced together from geological surveys, compass, rope, Isaiah's camera, and a journal Elijah had started keeping after their father passed. They drove off in their father's rust-colored Ford pickup, a trail of red dust spiraling behind them as they disappeared down Route 13 into the mouth of the forest. That was the last time anyone in Pine Hollow saw Elijah and Isaiah Cole alive. When they failed to check in by radio the first night, Ruth blamed the signal. When another day passed, she blamed the batteries. On the third day, when there was still no word, no returning engine hum up the gravel road, her hands began to shake. She called the ranger's station and the sheriff and the pastor and the town's only doctor. By morning, the search had begun. Dozens combed the trails, shouting their names into the trees, tracing paths that vanished into brambles, descending into ravines they might have fallen into. Helicopters hovered, dogs barked, but nothing turned up, not a boot print, not a scrap of nylon, not even a torn strap. It was as though the mountain had simply opened its mouth and swallowed the twins whole. The town whispered. Some said they'd run away, some said they'd fallen. Others said Pine Hollow had finally punished them for being too proud, too curious, too unwilling to stay in their place. A few old folks mentioned things in hushed tones about Cold War bunkers, about roads that never showed on maps, about base camps that didn't exist anymore. But those were just stories. Ruth refused to believe they were gone, not without a trace. Not her sons. Not her soul split into two names. She spent the first 2 years searching every weekend. She borrowed topo maps from the library, read military records, interviewed retired rangers. She even visited psychic fairs in neighboring counties. But the mountain gave her nothing. not a whisper, not a ghost. Eventually, life in Pine Hollow moved on. Babies were born, the railroad shut down, and outsiders started buying up land for summer cabins. The only thing that stayed the same was Ruth's porch light, always on at night, and the twin room, preserved exactly as they left it, Isaiah's lens cloth on the desk, Elijah's watch still ticking faintly in a drawer. People forgot, but she didn't. Not once, not for 49 years. Then in the spring of 2020, a man named Jalen Brooks, new to the Forest Service and fresh out of Tuskegee University, was assigned to patrol the northern range of Chimney Ridge, an area mostly untouched, rugged, and rarely visited. He had heard whispers about the Cole twins, of course. Who hadn't? Even in ranger school, their names came up like myth. But it was just local folklore. That is, until the third Thursday of April. That day, a sliver of afternoon sun cut through the trees just right, glinting off something half buried beneath moss and pine needles near the base of a twisted poplar. Jalen crouched, brushed back the dirt, and froze. It was a camera. An old, rusted Kodak. The strap was half-eaten by mold, the lens cracked, but the name on the underside was unmistakable. Cole! He whispered it aloud, heart suddenly pounding. Isaiah! The name rang like a bell through 5 decades of silence. He turned the body over, and against all logic, the film cartridge was still intact. He sat back, blinking at the light filtering through the leaves, realization slowly forming like fog. After nearly half a century, the mountain had finally spoken, and he was the one who had heard it. Jalen Brooks didn't sleep that night, not really, not in the way rest was supposed to settle a body. After returning to the ranger station with the camera locked in a weatherproof container, his hands still trembling, he sat alone at his desk with the overhead lights turned off and only the soft hum of the ceiling fan spinning in a hypnotic circle above him. He couldn't stop staring at the name scratched into the camera body, Isaiah Cole. He didn't know much about the case, just what folks said in hushed voices. 2 black brothers went into the Appalachians in 1971 and never came out. Some claimed it was the weather, others said it was sabotage. A few pointed to military testing sites no longer on record, but none of it ever stuck, not without evidence. Until now, at sunrise, Jalen made 2 phone calls. The first was to the FBI field office in Birmingham. The second, after much hesitation, was to the number listed under Ruth Cole's landline. He had found it in an archived file with the help of a sympathetic local librarian. The voice that answered was old and slow but steady, like the river stones shaped by time. "Mrs. Cole?" he asked gently. There was a pause. "Who's asking?" "Ma'am, my name is Jalen Brooks. I'm a ranger with the Appalachian Forest Service. I believe I've found something that belonged to your son Isaiah." Silence. Then a sharp inhale, more reflex than emotion. She didn't ask him to explain. She just said, "Is it yellow?" "No, ma'am," he said softly. It's a camera, a Kodak, with his name etched on the side." Another pause. This time it felt like the earth itself held its breath. "Bring it to me," she said. "Bring it today." By that afternoon, Jalen was standing on the porch of the Cole house, the same porch where Isaiah and Elijah had hugged their mother goodbye 49 years ago. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman hunched with age but unbowed in spirit. Her eyes, clouded by time, flashed open the moment she saw the box in Jalen's hand. She didn't say a word as he handed it over. Her wrinkled fingers traced the lettering on the camera as if reacquainting herself with the ghost of her son's handwriting. "He etched this with his house key," she whispered. "He said it was his way of saying, 'This is mine, no matter where I go.'" Jalen watched as she opened the film chamber and extracted the old roll of 35mm film, its edges stiff and discolored with time. "You think there's still something on here?" she asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know someone in Atlanta. They restore war film and disaster reels. If it's possible to save it, they can." She nodded slowly, still holding the camera like it might dissolve in her hands if she blinked. "Take it," she said. "If there's anything on that roll, I need to see it." 1 week later, Jalen returned. This time, he held a folder. Inside were 7 photographs. Some were damaged beyond saving, scratched, blurred, edges eaten by moisture. But others were eerily intact. He laid them out across the kitchen table like tarot cards, careful not to disturb the quiet that had settled over the room like mist. The first image, Elijah, standing atop a rocky outcrop, wind ruffling his curls, that yellow handkerchief tied around his belt. He was grinning, alive. The second, Isaiah, captured in the mirror of his own lens, adjusting the tripod, the rising sun glowing behind him like a halo. The third, a wide shot of the valley below, but from an odd angle, higher than any public trail would allow. And the fourth, Jalen hesitated before placing it. "You sure you want to see this one, Ma'am?" Ruth fixed him with a stare that was part mother, part soldier. "I've waited too long to flinch now." He placed it down. The photo was grainy, darkened in one corner, but clearly visible. The mouth of a cave, overgrown with brush. And in the lower left corner, barely caught by the frame, was the boot of another person. Not one of the twins. A military-issue boot. Ruth inhaled sharply. They weren't alone. "No," Jalen said. "I don't think they were." The next few days unfolded in motion blur. Jalen contacted a retired FBI investigator named Albert Gaines, who had spent part of his early career in counterintelligence, and showed him the photographs. Gaines studied them with a growing frown, particularly the fourth image and its background details. "This terrain," he muttered, "this cave system, it's nowhere on public record." Then he pulled out an old map from 1969. The spot matched an area once labeled as Topographical Survey Restricted. "There was a Cold War listening post here," he explained. "Unofficial. Part of Operation White Noise. Surveillance on internal communications. It was shut down by 73 or so, they said." "You think the boys stumbled into it?" Jalen asked. "I think they photographed something they weren't supposed to," Gaines replied. "And someone made sure they didn't walk away." With Ruth's blessing, the 3 of them, Jalen, Gaines, and the 92-year-old mother who refused to break, assembled a small team and headed for Chimney Ridge. Jalen marked the coordinates using the 4th photograph and overlaid them on modern terrain scans. They hiked for hours, trudging through thickets and over collapsed ridges. Then, just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, they found it, the cave. Not just any cave, the cave. It was exactly as pictured, almost hidden by overgrowth, its entrance camouflaged by time and silence. Inside, the air was cooler than expected, touched with the smell of mold and stone and something else, something faintly metallic. They pressed forward, Ruth leaning on Jalen's arm but refusing to stop. 50 meters in, the cave widened, and there, beneath the beam of their flashlights, lay the skeletons of a life erased. Rusted wires, broken consoles, satellite equipment covered in decades of dust. On the far wall, barely visible under grime, was the unmistakable insignia of an eagle clutching a signal tower. Operation White Noise. But it wasn't the gear that drew Ruth in. It was the far corner, where something small and cloth-like peeked out from under the rubble. She walked to it slowly, knees shaking, heart loud in her ears. She bent down, reached out, and lifted it. A yellow handkerchief, her son's, Elijah's. "He was here," she whispered. They both were. But there was more. Scratched into the wall, in uneven handwriting that bore the desperation of a final message, were the words, "Elijah shot. I am alive. They think I'm useful. If you find this, tell our mother we didn't mean to disappear." Signed, Isaiah, October 12th, 1971. Ruth fell to her knees, not out of weakness but out of sheer force, like something bigger than gravity had dropped onto her. Jalen knelt beside her, heart racing. They had found them, or part of them, but Isaiah's message wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Behind a collapsed panel in the rear chamber, Gaines found a stash of half-burned papers, orders, names, codes. One memo read, "Subject I, Cole, reassigned, no contact permitted." Another, "Dismantle base, erase trace, no witnesses." And then, handwritten in the margin, "Transfer complete, identity scrubbed." Jalen stared at it for a long moment before whispering, "He's not dead." Ruth looked up, eyes burning. "Then where is my son?" And so began the second search, not for bodies, but for the living. For the twin who had been erased not by nature, but by men in suits who decided his life was inconvenient. For the boy who once dreamed of publishing photographs and ended up a ghost in the margins of classified files. For Isaiah, her son, her survivor. They called 3 different agencies before one dared to answer with anything other than a polite deflection, and even then it was only after Albert Gaines dropped a name from an old case and invoked the Freedom of Information Act that a folder finally arrived, not by email, but by courier, double-sealed and marked confidential, a term that felt both sterile and sinister given what it contained. Ruth sat at the far end of the small government briefing room in Birmingham, her weathered fingers folded tightly in her lap as if holding herself together by force of will alone, while Jalen stood beside her, not as a ranger now, but as her advocate, her anchor in a storm 50 years in the making. Gaines, flanked by 2 silent men in plain suits who'd yet to offer their names, opened the folder like he was disarming a landmine. Inside were photographs, grainy black and whites, one showing a man strapped to a metal chair, shaved head, cheekbones sunken, eyes looking just beyond the camera. Ruth leaned forward. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She didn't need to be told. She knew her son's face, even through time's cruel distortions. "Isaiah," she whispered, her voice barely air. The accompanying documents were mostly redacted, lines struck through with black ink like wounds, but what bled through was enough. Detained in Panama 1972, accused of being a communist operative due to photographic evidence recovered near an unauthorized surveillance site. One sheet carried a chilling footnote. Subject retained for interrogation under Operation Enscope, potential for recruitment high, technically skilled, loyal behavior undetermined. Ruth's hands trembled, but she didn't cry, not yet. "What does that mean?" Jalen demanded. "Retained, recruited." One of the plain suits finally spoke, his voice clipped and cautious. During the Cold War, certain detainees were reassigned. Those with technical knowledge were offered alternatives to incarceration. Names were changed, identities erased. Some were embedded in domestic operations, others relocated overseas under aliases. It's complicated. "It's erasure," Ruth snapped, her spine straightening like steel, drawn from decades of mourning. "You buried my son under a new name and thought that made it legal." Silence fell like a gavel. But then came a knock at the door. A woman in a dark military uniform entered, eyes scanning the room before locking on Ruth. "Mrs. Cole," she said gently. "I'm General Michelle Ramirez, Director of Historical Clarification. We've recently received declassified material from U.S. archives in coordination with the Panamanian government. There's something I think you should see." On the conference table, she placed another folder. This one, thinner but heavier in emotional weight. Inside were more photos, this time dated 1973. Isaiah again, thinner, older, but undeniably alive, working at what looked like a communication hub surrounded by equipment. "He was transferred," Ramirez said, "to a facility in Arizona operating under Project Signal Shade, an experimental communications program run jointly by the Department of Defense and an unnamed agency. His skills in signal interpretation and radio diagnostics made him an asset." Ruth stared at her. "He was a photographer," she said quietly. "A boy who fixed radios and took pictures of birds. And you turned him into a ghost." The general didn't argue. "That's why I wanted to show you this." She reached into the folder and pulled out one final page, not a document, but a note, handwritten, found misfiled, in a decommissioned desk drawer during an audit. It read, If my mother ever finds out, tell her I never stopped looking at the sun, even when they made me sit underground." Ruth covered her mouth. For the first time in years, the tears came freely. But before anyone could speak again, the door opened a second time, and a younger officer stepped in, holding a slip of paper, his expression unreadable. "General," he said, "you may want to take this call. Someone's at the front. He asked for Ruth Cole." The room stilled. Ruth stood slowly. "What did he say his name was?" "He said his name was Jerome Walker," the officer replied, "but that he was born Isaiah Cole." Time fractured then, not in a violent way, but like glass under pressure, finally cracking, the years of loss and longing shattering at the edges of that single sentence. Ruth turned toward the hallway, not waiting for help, not needing permission. Her feet carried her faster than they had in years, down the corridor, past confused aides, into the foyer where a man stood with silver hair, a walking cane, and a scar just above his right eye, the one she used to kiss when he scraped his face climbing trees. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, eyes wide, brimming with something unspeakable. "Mama," he said, and the voice was older, cracked with age and swallowed screams, but it was still him. "Isaiah," she breathed, and in 2 shaky steps she was in his arms. For a moment, neither of them could speak, just stood there shaking, sobbing, as if trying to fill 5 decades with a single embrace. Jalen watched from a distance, his chest tight, hands curled. Gaines lowered his head and murmured something only the air heard. When they finally pulled apart, Ruth took Isaiah's face in her hands, studying every wrinkle, every line, every grief. "You were never lost to me," she whispered. "Not really." Isaiah nodded, unable to form words. In his pocket, he pulled something out, a small carved wooden pendant in the shape of a hawk, worn smooth by time. "Dad made this," he said. "I kept it, through everything." Ruth took it gently, tears streaming. "You still look for the sun," she whispered. He smiled, broken and whole at once. "Always." Later, in a quieter room, they spoke of what happened. Isaiah told her about Panama, about being given a choice between indefinite detention and service to national security. He told her about being moved under a new name, about the projects he worked on, the places he saw, the constant surveillance, the silence he had to maintain. "They told me if I ever reached out you'd be in danger," he said. "And after a while I started to believe them, that maybe you'd be safer thinking I was dead." Ruth shook her head. "I would have died not knowing." "I know," he said, voice cracking. "And I'm sorry." She forgave him instantly, because what mother doesn't? As the sun set outside the government building, casting orange light through blinds and across Isaiah's weathered face, Ruth reached for his hand. "We're going home," she said, "back to Pine Hollow, back where your brother's waiting." And he nodded, silent, overwhelmed, but not alone. Not anymore. They had survived history, politics, secrets, and silence. But in the end, they had survived each other's absence. And now, at last, they would survive together. They returned to Pine Hollow in silence, the long train ride from Birmingham weaving through fields that hadn't changed in 50 years, through forests that held memories like old wounds, through ghost towns where signs rusted and stories refused to die. And Ruth sat beside Isaiah, now called Jerome to the world, but always her son in the quiet corners of her mind, her fingers laced with his as though touch alone could reclaim the years they'd lost, and in his other hand he still held the carved wooden hawk their father had made, the one piece of his past they'd never taken from him. And as the town's familiar water tower came into view, marked with faded letters and streaks of rust, Ruth inhaled deeply, tasting a homecoming laced with sorrow and salvation, for though she had him now, whole and alive, she had not forgotten the other one, the one who hadn't made it out, the one who had died beneath an unknown tree on an unmarked mountain trail and had waited half a century to be brought home, and so within 24 hours of returning Isaiah, Jalen, and a crew of volunteer rangers hiked back into Chimney Ridge with GPS coordinates, digging tools, and a quiet reverence that stretched like mist through the trees. And Ruth waited at the ranger station, fingers clutching the yellow handkerchief they'd found in the cave, because even now, even with Isaiah breathing beside her, she knew the moment she saw her eldest son's remains again would be the moment the grief she had suspended for 5 decades would land in full. And so when the call came, short, solemn, final, she nodded. Tears not of surprise but of surrender already gathering in her eyes, and 3 days later, on a cloudless morning in the Pine Hollow churchyard, the town gathered around a mahogany casket lined with white lilies, and inside it a coffin holding the bones of Elijah Cole, confirmed by DNA and sealed with love, and Ruth stood beneath the oak tree her husband had planted the year the boys were born, her hands resting gently on the lid, whispering words no one else could hear, while Isaiah stood just behind her, shoulders squared, eyes closed, breathing in the scent of pine and dust and summer heat, and the townspeople watched in quiet awe as the woman who had never left and the son who had returned stood united beside the boy who had never come home until now, and Jalen said a few words, his voice steady, reminding everyone that justice came in many forms, sometimes in headlines, sometimes in bones, sometimes in the long arc of love refusing to break. And after the final prayer, Ruth placed a framed photo on top of the coffin, one of the recovered images from Isaiah's camera, the one where Elijah was smiling at sunrise, forever young, forever ascending. And the townspeople wept as they buried him with the flag his father once carried in war, and the yellow cloth folded into a square, pressed gently between the Bible and the earth. And afterward, as the sun dipped low and families returned to their homes, Ruth and Isaiah remained beneath the oak, the bark rough against their backs, the cicadas loud in the branches, and Isaiah whispered, "He died because of me." And Ruth turned to him with eyes not softened by forgiveness, but sharpened by knowing. And she said, "He died because they feared the truth, not because of you." And he nodded slowly, not because the guilt disappeared, but because her words made it bearable, and in the weeks that followed, they tried to settle into something like a rhythm. Ruth making breakfast again for someone other than herself, Isaiah waking up early to walk the perimeter of the woods, as if listening for echoes of a younger self. But it was Jalen, ever the quiet observer, who noticed it first. Something didn't line up, because according to the timeline, Isaiah's final message scratched into the cave wall was dated October 12, 1971, and yet the transfer documents, the ones with the redacted lines and the reassigned notes, were all dated 3 days later, October 15th, and that should have made sense, except for one memo buried among the scanned files, a memo dated October 11th, authorizing a transfer request that should have only been made after the handwritten note was discovered, which meant one thing. Isaiah's final message wasn't final. It wasn't written by a man fearing for his life before a transfer, but perhaps after he knew he was being moved, and that subtle reversal changed everything because it raised a question no one had asked. Why would Isaiah carve that message if he already knew he was being spared, reassigned, given a new name? Unless, of course, it wasn't Isaiah who wrote it, or unless someone else wanted that message found, as if to cover tracks or shift blame. And when Jalen confronted Isaiah with this, sitting on the porch with the evening light filtering through old screen windows, the older man's expression didn't change, but his silence grew heavy, and finally he said, "There are parts of that cave I never saw." And Jalen leaned forward, heart kicking into gear, and Isaiah continued, "They kept me blindfolded after Elijah. After the shooting, they made me record tapes, filter signals, log transmissions, but I never saw the message you found. I never carved that wall. I wanted to. God, I tried. But I was always under watch." The air froze. Jalen whispered, "So someone else wrote it?" Isaiah nodded slowly. "Or someone wanted it found." That night, Jalen couldn't sleep, so he drove back into the ridge with a flashlight and a camera, back to the cave that had become both a tomb and a confessional. and this time he focused on the details, the spacing of the letters, the depth of the grooves, the curve of the initials, and he saw it then, what he hadn't before. The name Isaiah was slightly off-center, the I too tall, the cross of the A cut differently than in the signed letters Isaiah had once written to his father decades ago, and Jalen took photographs, brought them back, and showed them to Gaines, who said, "That's not the same hand, it's forged. Sloppy, but just enough to pass." And slowly the theory formed. Not only had someone planted the message, they had planted it to imply that Isaiah was still in the cave on that day, to throw off the timeline, perhaps to delay any pursuit, to make sure no one came looking too soon. And if that was true, it meant someone inside the operation knew he was being moved and wanted the paper trail to lead nowhere, or worse, to make Isaiah complicit in his own disappearance. Convenient fiction, easier than acknowledging a live asset being taken and repurposed by the state. And as the realization settled in, Isaiah sat beneath the porch light, watching moths flutter against the bulb, and he said, "I thought I owed them my silence, but maybe all this time they owed me my name." And Ruth, seated beside him, her hand on his knee, said quietly, "No one gives you back what they took, but you can take it for yourself." And the next morning, Isaiah made his first public appearance, not as Jerome Walker, not as a retired technician, but as Isaiah Cole, survivor, veteran of secrets, and son of a woman who never stopped asking questions. And the press flooded in, and government officials scrambled, and beneath the weight of headlines and hearings and whispered apologies that came too late, Isaiah stood beside his brother's grave and told the world, "They wanted us forgotten, but we kept breathing, and we're still here." The interview aired 3 days later, filmed on the porch of the Cole house with the same oak tree swaying gently behind Isaiah as he sat flanked by Ruth and Jalen, the evening light casting shadows across his lined face like a canvas of memory and loss. And when the anchor asked him what he remembered most about the day, everything changed. He didn't speak of gunfire or interrogation rooms or coded directives. He spoke of Elijah's laugh as they reached the ridgeline, of the snap of camera shutters as the sun spilled across the valley, of the way the air tasted like pine and purpose. And it was that moment, not the politics or the programs, that resonated across America, because for the first time, someone had stepped out of the fog of history, not as a casualty or a statistic, but as a brother, a son, a man stolen and returned, and the response was immediate and thunderous. Social media exploded with the hashtag "Watch Isaiah is alive." Cable news re-aired the segment hourly, and within 48 hours, the Department of Defense issued a brief statement acknowledging administrative discrepancies in Cold War-era detainee records, which only fanned the fire further because the public didn't want bureaucratic backpedaling. They wanted truth, names, accountability, and as requests poured into the Historical Clarification Commission, Ruth received more letters in a single week than she had in the previous 3 decades, most from strangers. Black mothers who'd lost sons to war, to prison, to silence, thanking her for not giving up, for teaching them that grief didn't have to mean surrender. And while Ruth remained grounded in her quiet routines, cooking in the mornings, tending to her late husband's garden, humming old hymns while shelling peas, Isaiah was pulled into a whirlwind of appearances, interviews, briefings, his days a blur of microphones and closed-door meetings. And though he moved through it all with a quiet grace, it was clear to those closest to him that something gnawed beneath his composure, some thread left loose, and it wasn't until one night, weeks after the burial, that he finally gave voice to it, sitting across from Jalen at the edge of the town's overlook, the lights of Pine Hollow glowing below them like fireflies in a bottle, and he said, "I still don't know who wrote that message." And Jalen, leaning against the hood of his Jeep, nodded slowly. "You think it was someone trying to protect you?" And Isaiah shook his head. "No. If they wanted to protect me, they wouldn't have left me in that program for 20 years. They wanted to bury something else, and I think Elijah saw it, and those words, simple, weightless, landed like thunder, because they shifted the story from one of mistaken identity to one of obstruction, silencing, manipulation, and it made sense in the quiet horror of it all. Elijah had been the one carrying the camera, the one snapping shots of towers and cables and unfamiliar uniforms, and maybe, just maybe, what he saw wasn't just inconvenient, it was damning. And that changed the nature of the investigation entirely, because if Elijah had captured something that compromised the operation and Isaiah was taken alive, then someone had a reason to use Isaiah's survival as a cover for Elijah's execution. And that meant the cave message wasn't just misdirection, it was misdirection with motive. And Gaines, now reactivated as a consultant for the Senate Oversight Committee, began combing through old intelligence logs from the surrounding counties, looking not for Isaiah's name, but for command signatures, flight records, any pattern of movement that might explain who was at Chimney Ridge that wasn't supposed to be, and what he found was buried in a subfolder from Fort Ellington, a request for aerial surveillance suppression dated July 28, 1971, 2 days after the twins were reported missing, stamped urgent with a blacked-out requester ID and the destination labeled White Noise Ridge Unsecured Exposure Risk. And it wasn't conclusive, but it was enough to raise alarms, especially when paired with an internal memo sent 3 weeks later referencing photo capture discrepancy, eliminated subject, log message fabricated. And though no names were used, the context was unmistakable, and Gaines brought it straight to Ruth, whose fingers tightened around the paper without shaking, whose eyes moved across the page, not with surprise, but with slow, simmering fury, and she asked only one question. "Can you prove it?" And Gaines replied, "We're close." And that word, close, clung to the air like the scent of rain before a storm, because it meant the lie was unraveling. And as hearings began in Washington and names resurfaced, some still in office, some long retired, some dead and buried with secrets sewn into their bones, one piece still eluded them: the photographs themselves, the negatives, the raw evidence of what Elijah had seen, because although Isaiah's camera had been found and several images restored, the film reel referenced in the logs, the one flagged Class 3, suppress and extract, had never been located, and if it still existed, it could be the key to finally closing the chapter, to making the government say not just, "We made a mistake, but we buried your son and called it national interest." And so Isaiah returned to the mountain once more, not as a ghost, not as a prisoner of silence, but as a seeker, this time with Ruth beside him, her steps slow but deliberate, Jalen trailing close behind with a geolocation scanner and high-frequency equipment used to detect magnetic interference. And as they reached the cave again, the team began scanning every crevice, every panel, every false wall, until after nearly 2 hours of crawling through dust and darkness, a sensor lit up in the northern alcove behind a shallow stone slab wedged into the rock with unnatural symmetry. And when they pried it loose, inside was a rusted lockbox, corroded at the edges but intact, and within it, wrapped in cloth and tucked between old service manuals, was a second roll of film, labeled by hand, Subject Cole, Unauthorized Capture. And Ruth held it in her palms like a second funeral, like the ashes of truth. And 3 days later, under laboratory restoration, the images emerged, not in perfect clarity, but in terrifying shape. One showed a soldier in an unmarked uniform using a portable jamming device beside a satellite dish. Another displayed a stack of file boxes labeled Internal Transmission Logs with names of civil rights groups listed in red ink, and the final photo, blurred but haunting, captured the face of a man now serving as a senior intelligence advisor, standing in the cave, pointing directly at the lens with his mouth open, mid-command, as if realizing too late that the photograph would outlive the lies. And when that photo was released to the public, it didn't just end careers. It triggered a full-scale review of Cold War intelligence tactics, a flood of apologies to families long left in the dark, and in the middle of it all, Ruth and Isaiah stood once more beneath the oak tree. Not in mourning this time, but in quiet victory, the town of Pine Hollow buzzing with reporters and historians and neighbors who brought food not out of pity, but in reverence, and Ruth, holding the printed image of Elijah's final photograph, said to the camera, "My son died for this truth. My other son survived to carry it. And now Neither of them will be erased. And somewhere, in the branches above them, the wind rustled like a breath held too long, finally exhaled. The morning of the memorial dedication arrived with a stillness that felt sacred, as if the earth itself understood what it meant for truth to be spoken aloud where silence had once ruled, and the small town of Pine Hollow stood transformed, not just by time, not just by the paved roads and widened sidewalks or the new community library that bore Ruth Cole's name, but by memory itself, reclaimed and rethreaded into every corner of the town like a second heartbeat pulsing just beneath the surface. And on the hillside overlooking Chimney Ridge, beneath the canopy of oak and ash where birds sang like choirs of the past, a crowd gathered around the unveiling of a stone monument carved with the names Elijah Cole and Isaiah Cole, though one had passed and one still lived, because they had both been lost and returned, and Ruth stood before it, 94 now, her spine bent, but her gaze unshakable, wrapped in a dark green shawl Elijah had given her on his 17th birthday. And beside her, Isaiah, Jerome, to government files but never again to himself, stood tall in a grey suit, hands clasped, shoulders square, the same yellow handkerchief folded neatly in his breast pocket like a promise kept. And as the mayor stepped up to the podium to speak, the words seemed almost secondary to the hush that had fallen over the mountain, the sense that something unseen had come to witness this reckoning, the spirits of the disappeared, the voices of those once buried beneath bureaucracy. And when Ruth was invited to speak, she moved slowly to the microphone, every step echoing like a drumbeat across generations, and her voice, thin but unwavering, rang clear. My boys went looking for the sunrise, and for 50 years the world told me they never found it. But I know better now. They found it, and they became it. And the crowd, once holding its breath, erupted into applause, not of celebration, but of shared release. And Isaiah stepped forward then, placing a single photograph, Elijah's final one, now cleaned and restored, into the glass case embedded in the monument base, sealing it behind a layer of protective crystal so the valley could see forever what one young man had captured before the darkness came. And as the ceremony ended and people drifted toward picnic tables and reunion embraces, Isaiah remained standing before the monument, his eyes fixed on his brother's name. And it was then, as the crowd thinned and the wind picked up softly through the trees, that a woman approached him quietly, a face unfamiliar, but eyes strangely knowing, and she said, "You don't know me, but I knew your brother." And Isaiah turned slowly, studying her lined face, the faint southern drawl, the slight tremor in her hands as she pulled from her purse a wrinkled photograph showing Elijah in a bookstore, grinning, arms draped around the woman, who looked maybe 20 at the time, and Isaiah stared in stunned silence as she said, "My name is Clara. I met Elijah a few months before he disappeared. He used to leave poems in the spines of returned books. I kept every one I found. After he vanished, I thought they were just dreams." And Isaiah felt his knees weaken slightly as she pressed a sealed envelope into his hand, whispering, "He wrote this for you. Said he'd give it to you himself. I've kept it for 5 decades. I think it's time." And with that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd like a ghost made of kindness, and Isaiah stood there for a long moment before slowly sitting on the bench beside the monument, his fingers trembling as he broke the seal, and inside was a sheet of paper yellowed with age, but the ink still clear, still bold, still alive. "To my brother, if you ever read this, it means the world tried to bury us but failed. It means you made it home. And if you're reading this, then know, I knew you'd survive, because you always could find the way out, even when I couldn't. Tell Mama I heard her in the trees. I heard her praying every night, and tell her that the sun rises slow, but it always rises, always. I'll be waiting at the top, E." Isaiah's hand covered his mouth as a sob escaped him, quiet and ragged, and Ruth, watching from a few feet away, came to sit beside him, folding her hand over his like the first day she held him in the hospital. And they sat together like that, mother and son, survivor and witness, not saying anything because nothing needed to be said anymore, not now that the truth had finally found its way into the light, not now that the nation had seen what it had once refused to look at. And in the months that followed, Isaiah would go on to testify before Congress, not out of vengeance, but out of purpose, and he would help establish the Cold Silence Disclosure Act, a bill designed to declassify, recognize, and compensate families affected by secret state operations during the Cold War, and Ruth would live to see it signed into law, sitting in the front row of the chamber beside Jalen, whose quiet strength had carried her family through more nights than he realized. And when the president handed her the ceremonial pen, she didn't speak. But the tears in her eyes said everything. And not long after, Ruth passed away in her sleep on a rainy Thursday morning, clutching the carved wooden hawk and her son's final photograph, her face serene, the light on her nightstand still on, as it had been every night for 50 years, and Pine Hollow mourned her like a matriarch, like a monument of flesh and love, and Isaiah buried her beside Elijah under the same oak tree, her headstone simple, etched with only 5 words. She waited, and they returned, and as the years passed and time softened the sharp edges of sorrow, people still visited the Chimney Ridge Memorial, not for the politics, not even for the history, but because the story had become something larger, an anthem of endurance, a song of reunion, proof that even in the deepest shadows love could still light the way home, and sometimes when the sun broke across the ridge, just right, casting golden rays across the stone, someone would swear they saw 2 young men in silhouette, standing shoulder to shoulder on the horizon, one with a camera, one with a compass, both looking forward, forever chasing the sunrise.